We're very lucky to have Brad Porter here. Time is limited. We want to get to Q&A, so we're going to just jump right in, if that's all right, Brad.
Sounds great.
I'll do a quick intro, which will not do justice to Brad's amazing career. We've been talking backstage. Brad is the founder, CEO of Cobot. They build collaborative robotics for manufacturing, logistics, and health. Pretty amazing. Formerly prior to that, was the CTO at Scale AI. And prior to that, built out the robotics division at Amazon, where I still can't believe this number when I saw it was 500,000 robots, which you deployed over the course of your time at Amazon, which is just mind-blowing. There's much more, very just kind and generous person. Thank you for being here, Brad. Let's jump into the conversation. We talked before, and I think it's worth for the audience to hear, why do you care about this issue of responsible innovation? And let's just start there. Why is this important to you?
Yeah, I think we're fortunate, right, to have these roles where we're helping build the future. But we have to be intentional in thinking about what's the future we want to live in, and so I spend a lot of time thinking about this topic. I think it's very hard to predict the future and to predict some of the both positives and the consequences of your technology, but I think it's important to be thoughtful about it as you develop, as you build teams, as you build cultures, as you build technology, and as you change the world and society. How are we hopefully making it better?
Yeah. Let's talk about we just talked about you being at Amazon, hyperscale, Scale AI, big. You're now 3 years into Cobot. Let's talk a little bit about the lessons you've learned from seeing, you've seen that growth, you've seen it at scale, you're now seeing it early stage. How do you think about building that culture? We'll talk a little bit about culture in a minute, but what are you bringing into the earliest stages at Cobot, and what do you see down the road as you're successful?
Yeah, I think there's, at the scale we were operating at Amazon, right? You have this system-wide impact and effect, right? And those things that you're like, hey, that might never happen. Well, when you have 1 million employees and 500,000 robots, those things happen, yeah. Right? And so I think that combination of understanding, hey, as this early startup, you've got to be scrappy, you've got to get your product out there, you've got to try things, you can't be completely conservative and cautious in everything you're doing, but knowing that, hey, we want to have 1 million robots out there, and when we have 1 million robots out there, any edge case that can happen is going to happen, right? And so being thoughtful about how you balance, I have this kind of rubric of scrappy, crappy, and rigorous, right? Look, crappy is never a place to be, engineering, business, anyway, so avoid that, right? So I talk to my team about this all the time, is I'm not asking you to do crappy things. Sometimes people hear that the CEO is asking you to take a shortcut, and it's yeah, I'm looking for ways that we can, in a scrappy way, move the company forward quickly. But if you tell me it's crappy, then we'll stop the conversation and figure out how not to be there. But then there's a time for rigorous too, right? Where, safety certifications or other pieces. But I also talk to the team about rigorous is an investment, right? It's a decision that we need to do something in a rigorous way. And as an early startup, you can only really afford so many places where you're rigorous. A lot of places you're scrappy. Those places where you're going to be rigorous should be those places that differentiate your product or your offering, right? And rigorous safety certification is a significant value proposition in a robot like ours, right? And so that's worth that investment. But there are other places where, at the logging and monitoring infrastructure can be scrappy right now, yeah. Right? It doesn't. There are plenty of engineers who'd love to make it rigorous, and at some point we'll have rigorous logging and monitoring, all of this, right? But right now we'll get away with, what we can get away with scrappily. But on those pieces that differentiate your product, for us, trustworthy design is one of those. We've invested in a trustworthy design pretty much from day one because we felt that's, a foundational differentiation. As you bring new technology into hospitals, into all these spaces, the perception of trustworthiness is incredibly important in all the experiences that people have, not just with robots, but with any new technology, I think.
Let's spend, it's a good segue into talking about trade-offs, but before we do that, let's talk a little bit about what you're building. You shared a milestone backstage that I think the audience should hear about. So tell us a little bit more about what you're building at Cobot and what happened yesterday.
Yeah, we're developing a mobile collaborative robot. So some of the genesis of this is just, I led robotics for Amazon. We looked a lot at where humanoid robots might have potential. We found a lot of use cases where they might have potential, but then asked the inverse question, if we were to solve these process paths from first principles, would you use a humanoid robot? And the answer in all 42 use cases we looked at was no. You would use something that has wheels, because in commercial environments, you have flat floors, right? You would use something with a lower center of mass because you want the stability, you want the safety, you want it not to fall over. You'd use something with fixed mount sensors, right? You wouldn't have the sensing on this head wobbling around like that. That's not a great way to get stable perception. And you'd have something that was really strong because, humans get away with lifting a 40-pound tote but struggle with it, right? And you don't want a robot that's struggling with that. And humanoid robots don't actually have the strength of humans. And so how would we build a robot that could do those types of tasks, those type of kind of human scale material movement that had all those features we were looking for: stable sensing, really precise mobility, low center of mass, very strong. And so that's what we built. We built a robot called Proxy. It's 6 foot tall. It fits through a doorway, so it's about 26 inches by 26 inches. It can lift over 200 pounds. It can pull carts over 1,500 pounds. And so we have these robots deployed with Maersk, the global shipping company, moving carts and transload operations, but we also have it deployed with Mayo Clinic. We started at Mayo Clinic in their specimen processing lab. So they process tens of thousands of samples from around the world every day, but there are a number of process paths in that, which, were just technicians moving carts back and forth. And so we enable the technicians to really focus on processing the samples, and our robots take care of moving the carts around. But what I was mentioning, I was actually in Rochester, Minnesota yesterday, and it was we're now moving into the main hospital. And so yesterday was the first day that we did a fully autonomous cart movement in the main hospital alongside public patients. So yeah, that's super exciting. And in 2 weeks, we'll be doing that as a production workflow.
That's great. Well, let's take it from there. I mean, you talk about trustworthiness, which I know is super important. We hear a lot about AI safety. I mean, I think part of what's interesting about our conversation is in the physical world, I guess as you see the AI's responsibility, safety, whatever, you could put all the terms to it. What's the same and as you build trustworthy technology and what's different?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's obviously, in today's ChatGPT and world, you're interacting through this text screen, right? You just close the window if you don't like what it's doing, right? But now you're sharing physical space with a robot, and do you really trust its motion and how it's behaving, right? And I mean, I thought this was a good example. A friend of mine's a user experience designer, and she came in and kind of looking at it from first principles and like, what happens if you ask it to go grab John Lee? Like, does it physically grab him? Does it, semantically, what do you, and so the semantics of language and how they interact with the physical world have more consequences, right? And so I think as we think about fusing large language models, vision, language action models into robots and into perception, there are going to be edge cases that that are, sometimes socially awkward, sometimes be funny, sometimes risky, right? And so we think a lot about, trustworthiness in every element of what the robot does and how it communicates, even visually how it communicates. One day we rolled out a new feature where we have a number of LEDs on the system. They're colored LEDs, where the LEDs blinked red for about 5 seconds, right? Every associate in that Maersk building was like, "What's wrong?" Right? We rolled that feature back instantly. We're like, no, we can't blink red. Like,
Terminator's here.
yeah, and they weren't scared of the robot. They were actually like empathetically worried about the robot. It's something, or is there an emergency, right? And it's like, oh, we signaled the wrong thing. But you have to think about those elements. We added something recently to the robot when the battery's low. The proxy just says, my battery's critically low, I need a new battery, right? But it's funny because we just had one sitting in the office, and it started to say that. And one of our executive assistants like ran back to the engineering lab, was like, proxy needs help, like what's going on, right? And so anyhow, you can, this idea that robots are, like, we have an empathetic response, particularly as these robots behave more in ways that are in some ways are human-like or can communicate. And I think that's both a very powerful thing and a thing we have to be very, very careful with.
Wow. Okay, I actually want to just pivot on that, just to go back to the customers, because we hear from a lot of startups about the challenge of you're selling into health systems, very established. They may not know sort of what to ask. When you're demonstrating that trustworthiness, like how much of that is you proactively sort of in your go-to-market, frankly, giving them that assurance, and how much of that is them saying, Brad, this is what we really need, prove it?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at our messaging, our branding, our website, like, because I've been adamant about this in day one, everything's about trustworthiness, right? Everything's from a foundation of trust. And then you'll actually see me sometimes like calling out other robotics founders when they like put a robot arm with a blowtorch and try to, cook a Thanksgiving turkey. I'm like, that's not helping anybody.
Right.
I mean, it's fun, but it's fun in like a very 14-year-old way. And so, you'll see that infused throughout. And when we do talk to customers about bringing robotics in, we talk about it as change management, right? As both the like helping staff and the teams really understand the capability of this robot's bringing and how it's going to make, the function of that lab or that warehouse or, even perform even better. And when we do that, the teams are motivated, everyone's excited about it. But if you do that poorly, then people rightfully push back on, why are you bringing this technology in? How is this making anything better? And so you have to be proactive, and we do work with customers a lot on how to signal those and how to have those conversations.
Has anything surprised you about that feedback, where you're like, oh, that's not right, but I guess we have to dispel that, or vice versa, where you're like, okay, we had a blind spot there?
Well, so I learned a lesson at Amazon around how operators of these warehouses and systems think. And so we were doing a deployment of a new drive-based sortation system for Amazon, the first one at a facility in Denver. And I went and visited, and I'd been following the program from my office in Seattle. I've been following the program, and everything looked green, everything looked on track, but I wanted to get down there to see it. And I caught up with my team before, and they were like, yep, everything's green, everything's on track. And then I met with the GM for the building, and he was like, I don't think this program's like, I don't see anything happening, right? Like it's not moving ahead. Like I don't think this is on track. I don't really trust the team you have on this. And I was like scratching my head, understanding why. And what I eventually figured out was that, and this is a conversation I had with my own, like, I realized my own team at Cobot had this blind spot when we first went into Maersk. Our software engineers thought, because we set up a 3-month kind of testing window before we went into production, they thought that they would show up for a day or two a week, test the robotic system, and then go back to their offices or home offices and continue software development on the system. And I said, actually, no, we're going to get there at 8 a.m. every day, and we're going to work till 5 p.m. in that building for the full 3 months. And they said, why? Like, that's not the most productive from a software. And I said, well, look, we have this lab space to test the robot, but also you have to put your mindset in the mind of the operator, which is, if you're an operator of a building, what you care about when it comes to a vendor or your employees is, do they show up on time, and how hard do they work, right? And so the way you build trust with an operator in a building, and the mistake we made at Amazon was not that the program was off track. The mistake we made was that we weren't there. And so from his standpoint, how do you know what's really going on here? How do you really understand? And from his standpoint, how hard are you really working on this? And so I'd learned that lesson at Amazon, and so we adopted that at Maersk. We showed up every day. We're there every day still, and that is what signaled trust. Like, you understood what they care about, which is, look, are you diligent? Do you show up on time? Do you work hard? And that's what they value, and so that's what we communicate.
Yeah, it speaks to the communicating with impacted sort of stakeholders that we talked about earlier today. Yeah, please.
It's also why you don't want a robot sitting on a battery charger, right? Because, I mean, you have a bunch of people who are working their tails off every day, and you've got a robot just sitting there on a battery charger not doing anything, right? It just looks idle. It looks like it's not doing work. Swappable batteries is a solvable technology, so you just swap the batteries and have the robot keep working. But yeah, those little things go a long ways. Like, people don't realize that the fact that a whole bank of robots is sitting there on it causes the team and staff to be like, those are lazy robots, right? And yeah, so you have to build trust in kind of everything you signal.
You mentioned something earlier that I want to touch on, which is, was it scrappy, crappy, and rigorous, which speaks a lot to trade-offs. And one thing we hear a lot and talk to founders a lot is about, like, responsible innovation to us is not perfection. You're not chasing perfection, and it's not zero risk. So you're constantly, like, having to sharpen that muscle, build that muscle. So, I mean, either an example you can share from Cobot, or just sort of generally, like, how you approach that and how you might coach founders to think about that.
Thinking about the trade-off.
The trade-off, like, where there may not be a clear-cut answer, or even between scrappy and rigorous.
Yeah, I think, I think there are always trade-offs. I think, I do come back to, is this differentiating the product, right? Or is this differentiating the company, right? Like, we're debating a 3-year-old startup, 100 people. How rigorous should our, peer feedback performance process be, right? And, to some extent, the question is that process differentiating Cobot from some other startup employer? Probably not, right? Now, is it a good best practice that we're giving people some feedback in a somewhat structured way? Yes, but we shouldn't spend, big tech companies can spend 6, 8, 12 weeks in that process. We should figure out how, like, the average time commitment for the team, like, you just balance. What do you think is the right time commitment for the team? And you say, you know what, like, 90 minutes to 2 hours per employee is about what we want to invest in this process. So how do we make the feedback mechanisms light enough weight? How do we make the review process simple enough where we can get people meaningful feedback, but with a kind of bounded amount of time, effort? And so, that's, I think a lot of it's kind of right sizing and saying, is this differentiating, or is this just, a core thing? And just asking yourself on everything, which is, anything in a startup, speed matters, time matters. Time is dollars, right? In in a startup, and startups are always running in the negative kind of at the beginning, and so anywhere where you decide to invest time, you want to get kind of some level of compounding return on it. And again, I think responsible innovation can differentiate your product in a significant way. And I think the right process, we invest in a great interviewing experience. We do think a great interviewing experience differentiates us in our ability to close candidates. And like our interviewing process, our closing process, we have an over 90% close rate on candidates we make offers to. That differentiates us as a company, and it saves us time. You know what? I've been at companies where we had a 50% close rate, and it's twice as much recruiting effort for the whole company, right? And so again, looking at things through that time lens, through that differentiation lens, and saying, how do we do the right level of investment to achieve the outcome we're trying to reach?
All right, last question for me, and then we'll open it up. I know you write a lot about it. You obviously are on podcasts and doing videos, culture, high-performing culture. You've been, again, scale, Amazon. Amazon's like, I don't know, it used to be 14 principles. I don't know what it is now. Talk a little, I know it's important to you. Talk a little bit about how you're building it right now.
Yeah, I think like one of the things I was most excited about with being a founder was I felt like I was often trying to influence the culture around me. And I think I did influence the culture in a significant way at Amazon, at scale, at the Netscape and Tell Me before that. But I was always influencing another culture versus, getting to kind of define from first principles the culture I wanted to work in, right? And I think what we focused on at Cobot was not just trustworthiness in the product, but Amazon has this earns trust leadership principle, and I never really loved it because it felt like it was setting it up in an adversarial way from the beginning, which is you don't get trust, you have to somehow earn it, and I just realized that the time that I as a leader spent trying to earn people's trust sometimes was important. Like, in other words, yes, you need to behave with ethics and integrity and be a trustworthy person and communicate expectations clearly and lead with transparency, authenticity. You can do all of these things. And then what I realized, you can do all these things and then some people still don't trust you. And it's not really you, it's something from their past, it's something in their history, or they're just kind of temperamentally wired to be deeply skeptical. And so we said at Cobot, we actually wanted a culture that wasn't, we wanted a leads with trust culture, that how we interacted with each other should start from a position of trust. It doesn't mean there aren't trust busters. It doesn't mean that, like, some organization didn't promise something and then not deliver, and there needs to be some accountability, and there's a little bit of like broken trust that happens. All that's fine. But if you generally bring together a team that leads with trust in their interactions with each other, then you re-heal to trust. And everyone, every HBR article you read will tell you that, high performance teams are high trusting teams, but then they try to put all that responsibility on the manager to create that trust context. And they don't always look at the inputs, which is, do you have a team that leads with trust in their interactions, or have you brought in some folks who just lead with skepticism in kind of how they work? Now, the interesting phenomenon, though, is as in pulling in people who lead with trust, we've also brought in people who are generally high EQ, high levels of empathy. That's also tremendous. Like, it makes it a really positive environment. But there's a bit of maybe not always sharing the feedback, right? Not always being, and so having to kind of go back to the culture and say, okay, this foundation of leading with trust is what we want. But sometimes, trusting is trusting that the other person can take the hard feedback, right? And just kind of having to dial some of those things into the culture. But that's way easier than spending all of your management time trying to persuade the 4% of individuals who just aren't going to trust their peers or management ever, regardless.
there have to be some exceptions or pushback. Questions? Yes, people have mics, so can we get a mic up here? Otherwise, you can shout as well, but introduce yourself and...
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you very much. My name is Irina Azu. I'm a data scientist. I work in responsible AI and special projects at Airbnb. My question is about humanoid robots. So you said earlier, humanoid robots are not as strong as humans. Now, humans have complex muscle and skeletal structures that make us very load-bearing. So do non-humanoid machines. They can also carry quite a bit of load, but not humanoid robots. So what I would love to hear is a little bit more generalization around the limits of robotics. What can they do well? What are the boundary conditions? What can they not do well?
Yeah, well, I think if we think about strength and actuation, we're getting into a much more technical kind of domain. We've figured out how to get a lot of power density out of torque, right? Out of rotational torque. What humans do, we don't really have anything that's rotational, right? We get most of our strength out of linear motion. We also get a lot of it by having really sophisticated controls that can kind of deal with the dynamic complexity of almost a like suspension bridge like structure in our hands. But so when we think about robots today, there's debates about do you use linear actuation or do you use rotational actuation. Very rarely do people put a lot of linear actuation. Sometimes tendon-driven, digits or things like that, cables. That gives you that's a way of translating rotational motion to linear motion. But the loss in that translation from rotational to linear is substantial. So you've lost a lot of the power in that system. And then just, our versions of linear actuators, things that just collapse like our muscles do, are generally not as strong or capable as our muscles. And so that does lead to limitations in robotics, right? That does lead to, we make tractors that have large wheels to deal with bumps and ravines and mud, right? But we don't do multi-legged tractors generally. And so, the physics end up dictating the form if you let them. If you try to let biological inspiration dictate the form, then you end up with something, then you would end up with a tractor that looks like a horse, and but it wouldn't be as capable as a John Deere.
Great question.
Hi, my question is, I know the intentionality around keeping human in the loop. Oh, thank you so much. Hi, I'm Anita Vadavata with AB Plus Ventures. My question is, trustworthy design, but is it always thinking human form factor as the one that one has to work with from whether it's a Cobot or the machines or the humanoids or whatever variants of that? What does it even mean when in a hybrid work environment where humans and machines and machine and human interaction, but also machine-machine interaction, that's as important in terms of not only navigating the physical spaces, but also performing intelligent tasks. So how do you even approach to what degree of adaptability to human in a long run or a mid-range versus immediate need?
Yeah, I think if you're going to work in human environments alongside humans, you need the way I think about trustworthiness at another level down is clarity of expectations. An expectation well set and an expectation well met, right? It's the foundation, and you do that repeatedly, and you can build trust, or you just never break it, and then you don't lose trust, right? And so we think a lot about the expressiveness of or how we express the robot. So for instance, if you put eyes up higher, then it signals greater intelligence. Like just how we cue into things, the lower it is to the ground, generally the less intelligent it is, the higher it is. And so we do that differentiation. So we started by putting our our eyes on our robot closer to kind of seeing eye dog level, because we wanted to communicate about that level of intelligence. Now, it's interesting, as our robot does become more an intelligent companion, less, just doing a lot of kind of material movement work, and maybe it is more interacting, maybe it is helping to provide that surgical tool to that surgeon. I expect the eyes and the kind of facial expression will move up on that form factor. So I think there's a lot that you express that signals to a human what you should expect from this robot. And if you set those expectations well, when people make a humanoid that looks like a child, right? You expect it to be a little funny. You expect it to be a little unpredictable. You don't necessarily trust it, though, right? You don't necessarily think it's safe because your typical 6-year-old isn't necessarily trustworthy. They're safe, but they're usually pretty funny. So it's what you want to signal.
We're basically at time. We could go all day. Brad, any quick final takeaway for our audience?
No, I think just we're in a phase of substantial technology transformation, right? I think the internet really changed how communication worked in the world, and I think we saw downstream effects of that even 20 years later that are different than what those of us at Netscape, when we were trying to build all this, anticipated. And now we have new problems to solve, that emerge from that. AI and robotics are going to be a similar, if not even more impactful transformation. I am an optimist that abundance can really improve society, but I do also believe that that's only true if we build it that way, right? So this idea that we aren't responsible somehow, just build it and then figure it out, I don't believe that. I think those of us who are at the front building, therefore, have even more responsibility to try to think about how it'll work, and then to try to fix the sharp edges that come up.
Fantastic. Thank you, Brad Porter. Thank you very much.